Joining me first, Major General Garrett Yee, Acting Deputy Chief Information Officer for the U.S. Army Chief G6, and Bob Fortna, President of Fortinet Federal. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining me. General, I want to start with you first. What are you doing on modernization in particular, and how is cybersecurity tied into the modernization effort that you're undertaking in the Army?
Well, Francis, that's a great question. For the past over 2 years, the Army has been focused on modernization. And in fact, recently announced the new 4-star command, the Army Futures Command, to be stationed in Austin, Texas. And so what the Futures Command will focus on is modernizing the Army. Across the Army, there are 6 priorities, and one of those is the network. And so with that focus on the network, obviously, there also comes this focus and need to focus on cybersecurity. And it's not just the network that needs that cybersecurity focus. It's all things that are connected somehow to the network. And so in a high level, modernization for the Army in 6 priority areas, modernizing the network, and along with that, focused on cybersecurity.
How has the number of things that are connected to that network and the nature of those things, the functions they perform, changed the way that you and your colleagues approach cybersecurity?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. All you have to do is walk into any building today and see how many things are connected to the network. You're Bluetooth enabled, you're Wi-Fi enabled, and everything that you see there is also coming through to our Army installations and our Army capabilities. An example that I like to use when we talk about how do you, handle cybersecurity and the vulnerabilities that it could bring is the reference to Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It's a book about a kid who had a rich uncle and a poor dad, and his dad worked so hard. And the takeaway for me from that book was, and I'll tell you how this relates to cybersecurity, and that is, if someone gave you a car, did they give you an asset or a liability, right? And so one might say, hey, I got a car, put it on the asset column. Well, you have to pay for the gas, the insurance, the maintenance, and so it's a liability. If someone gave you something to put on the network, did they give you an asset or a vulnerability, right? And so if they give you something that you put on the network that's Wi-Fi enabled, Bluetooth enabled, and not secure, well, then they gave you a vulnerability. So all those things that we're bringing into the capabilities of all the services have that same dilemma. It's great to have that capability, but you may have also received a liability or vulnerability at the same time.
Bob, you've told me before that the Internet of Things is something that presents a terrific opportunity and a terrific potential challenge for agencies across government. What do you see organizations doing to assess the kinds of things that the General just talked about, whether something that they're adding to their network is an asset or a vulnerability that might wind up causing more problems than it helps?
Well, the Internet of Things brings a lot of asset, but when we're talking about cybersecurity, we have to consider the tremendous volume of data and complexity that mobility brings, all the Wi-Fi enabled things. It just grossly exaggerates the volume of data coming into the network and the complexity. That coupled with the complexity of the new attacks that we're seeing and the speed at which they're hitting the network today is a real problem. And the way we've handled it up to now really has been, well, let's add new tools. What we need are new tools to address these threats and surround the whole complex architecture with human putty. The humans become, the glue that keeps everything together. But in this world, in this day and age and going forward, it's not sufficient. It's just too much volume, too fast. And what we have to do is approach the problem, the way we've done many things over time, which is we have to automate it. We have to, instead of having, unique, independent devices and tools throughout your network with people making decisions and connecting, we have to have a system of connected devices that work together at machine speed, using automation and machine learning as close to the threat as possible, so we can, identify it, mitigate it, and deploy the solution before it enters the network.
One challenge I suppose you don't have, General, is getting close to your threat. I mean, you have a universal landscape. You have vulnerabilities potentially all over the world because that's where your network is. What's the implication there for how you go about building a cybersecurity strategy when you have potential access points, I mean, everywhere around the world?
Hey, that's a great question, Francis. You know, the going-in assumption is that there's infiltration. The going-in assumption is that you're exposed, right? And so although we will spend a lot of energy and effort to lock down the perimeter, to lock those gates down, we will also, at the same time, place a lot of focus on protecting the data itself. So I may be able to get into the network, but as long as the data is protected and secure, then we'll be in a better place.
Mm-hmm. Bob, this impact of this borderless network, strategically, what are the elements that people should be thinking about when they're approaching it? Because it's pretty obvious that the Army network or another military network is not going to have a border. I think there are probably folks that don't think that necessarily about their own network when it's probably the case in real life.
Yeah, I think you have to start in the beginning by, first of all, discovering who's in your network and who's trying to enter your network as a first step. And then you need to implement some type of network access control based on role identification and policies for access, you know, depending on where they're coming from and what their role is. You have to look at the data they want access to, and you have to make some conscious decisions and policies, procedures for who can access the data, and how do you segment and protect and firewall that data so that only those identified and given role responsibilities can access the data that they're intended to access. And then finally, you have to monitor constantly, because there's going to be unknown threats that come in. And so you're going to need some type of advanced threat protection, sandboxing, and you need some type of machine learning capabilities so that you can address these things fast in minutes rather than days.
We have about a minute left, General. It sounds like, as you're nodding your head in agreement with the things that Bob is saying, that those are all agenda items for you already.
Absolutely. Identity, credential, and access management is a fast maturing effort, commercially and in the services. And so maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago, once you had access to the network, you had access to everything. And now it's about really who you are, your persona on the network, and what do you have a need to have access to. And so Bob's spot on in terms of that important piece.
General Yee, Bob, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Entrepreneurial Government is brought to you by Fortinet Federal. Trust Fortinet Federal to advance the science of cybersecurity in your agency. To learn more, visit fortinetfederal.com.